Chances are you've received dozens of emails over the last few weeks about the GDPR, and you may have even heard some authors freaking out about it, afraid they'll be thrown into some European dungeon if they don't make changes to their website. I'd like to explain why, as an American author, you have nothing to fear from GDPR. But first, I'm Thomas Umstattd Jr. with Author Media, and I am not a lawyer. This is purely my opinion based off of my research on what's going on with international law. So first, what is GDPR? GDPR is the General Data Protection Regulation that the EU Parliament passed a couple of years ago. Now, according to the EU, this law applies to the entire world, or at least the only parts of the world that interact with Europe, which is pretty much all of it. The only catch is, though, is that the EU is not the United Nations. They are not actually the government of the world. So, can they force Americans to follow this law? The reality is, it may not actually be the case. Now, for most American companies, they have a presence in the European Union. Google has offices in the EU, as does Facebook and all the other big companies. So those big companies absolutely have to follow this law. But if you live in America and your business is based in America, how can the EU force you to follow the GDPR? Well, the reality is we won World War II, not them. We have troops in Europe. Europe does not have troops in America. The only way the European Union can get an American citizen to follow one of their laws is to ask nicely, and specifically to ask the American government nicely in order to enforce this law. Now, remember, this is an American government that even when they have a treaty on climate change, they're not following it. They'd rather not work with the European Union on an issue like climate change. Why would they work with the European Union on an issue like GDPR when there's not a specific agreement in place? Now, EU is hoping that they can rely on past treaties in order to enforce this regulation, but that hope has not been proved in court. So I think that you are most likely very safe from the GDPR because you're not a European. Unless you live in Europe, in which case you absolutely need to follow the GDPR guidelines. Now, I will say that a lot of the GDPR guidelines are common sense regulations that you should be following anyway. If someone wants to delete their content on your website or their data on your database, they should be able to do that. People shouldn't be opted in to email newsletters that they aren't knowing what they're getting into. As an author, you should make it explicitly clear what people are getting, and you should make it explicitly clear how to get out so they can explicitly give you their consent and withdraw it without having to dig through a privacy policy or some other legal jargon. Speaking of privacy policy, that's also a good practice. It's a good idea to have a privacy policy on your website and to have one that is easy to understand. This isn't just a good neighborly thing to do to our European friends, but it's also benefited by Google. So the United States government may not require a privacy policy, but the kingdom of Google does. And so it is a good idea to comply with this law. So I don't think this is something to worry about. I don't think it's something to fear. A lot of authors are treating this like Y2K, that when GDPR kicks in, suddenly the European government is going to send troops to America to round up authors and throw them in jail. That's just not going to happen. First off, it's not even a criminal law. It's a civil law. It's a civil law that hasn't been tested in European courts, that's tenuously connected to maybe some treaties that were signed in the past that have not been proven in an American court. So my opinion, not as a lawyer, is you have nothing to fear. I'm Thomas Umstattd Jr. with Author Media. Thanks for watching.